Aristophanes. 1. Aristophanes and the War. Greek tragedy is more somber than the Elizabethan because it seldom employs that principle of comic relief by which, through a humorous interruption of the tragical, the auditor's tolerance for tragedy is increased. The Greek playwright preferred to keep his tragic drama on a persistently high plane and relegated comedy to a satyr play which carried no serious import but allowed the excited emotions of the audience to subside into humor and ease. In the course of time, the comic drama declared its independence of tragedy, and a day was allotted to it, at the Dionysian festivals, when the entire program consisted of 3 or 4 comedies, written by different authors, played in succession and competing for a separate prize. Comedy, like oratory, had its first Greek bloom in Sicily. About 484 there came to Syracuse from Kos a philosopher, physician, poet, and dramatist, Epicharmus, who expounded Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and rationalism in 35 comedies, of which only occasional quotations remain. 12 years after Epicharmus's arrival in Sicily, the Athenian Archon allowed its first chorus to comedy. The new art developed rapidly under the stimulus of democracy and freedom and became the principal medium in Athens of moral and political satire. The wide license of speech permitted to comedy was a tradition of the Dionysian phallic procession. The abuse of this freedom led in 440 to a law against personal attacks in comedy, but this prohibition was repealed 3 years later, and full freedom of criticism and abuse continued even during the Peloponnesian War. The Greek comedy took the place as political critic of a free press in modern democracies. We hear of many comic dramatists before Aristophanes, and the great Rabelais of antiquity even condescended to praise some of them when the smoke of his battles with them had cleared away. Plotinus was the mouthpiece of Cimon, and made rabid war against Pericles, whom he called the squill-headed god almighty. Merciful time has spared us the necessity of reading him. Another forerunner was Pherecrates, who about 420 satirized in The Wild Men those Athenians who professed to dislike civilization and to long for a return to nature. So old are the brave innovations of our youth. The ablest competitor of Aristophanes was Eupolous. They at first cooperated, then quarreled and parted, after which they satirized each other vigorously, but still agreed in attacking the Democratic Party. If comedy throughout the 5th century was hostile to democracy, it was partly because poets liked money and the aristocracy was rich, but chiefly because the function of Greek comedy was to amuse with criticism, and the Democratic Party was in power. Since the leader of the democracy, Pericles, was sympathetic to new ideas like the emancipation of woman and the development of a rationalist philosophy, the comic dramatists ranged themselves with suspicious unanimity against all forms of radicalism, and called for a return to the ways and reputed morals of the men of Marathon. Aristophanes became the voice of this reaction, as Socrates and Euripides were the protagonists of the new ideas. The conflict between religion and philosophy captured the comic stage. Aristophanes had some excuse for liking aristocracy, since he came of a cultured and prosperous family, and appears to have owned land in Aegina. His very name was a patent of nobility, meaning the best made manifest. Born about 450, he was in the springtime of life when Athens and Sparta began that war which was to be a bitter theme of his plays. The Spartan invasion of Attica compelled him to abandon his country estate and come to live in Athens. He disliked city life and resented the sudden demand upon him to hate Megarians, Corinthians, and Spartans. He denounced this conflict of Greek killing Greek and called, in play after play, for peace. After the death of Pericles in 429, supreme power in Athens passed into the hands of the rich tanner Cleon, who represented those commercial interests that wanted a knockout blow, that is, the utter destruction of Sparta as a competitor for the mastery of Greece. In a lost play, The Babylonians, of 426, Aristophanes subjected Cleon and his policies to such stinging ridicule that the burly Strategos prosecuted him for treason and had him fined. 2 years later, Aristophanes revenged himself by presenting The Knights. Its leading character was Demos, that is, the people, whose major domo was called the Tanner. Everyone understood the transparent allegory, including Cleon, who saw the play. The satire was so sharp that no actor would play the part of the Tanner for fear of political misfortune, whereupon Aristophanes took the role himself. Nicias, the name of the superstitious leader of the oligarchic faction, announces that an oracle has told him that the next ruler of Demos's house will be a sausage seller. Such a huckster comes along, and the slaves hail him as chief that shall be of our glorious Athens. "Prithee," says the sausage seller, "let me go wash my tripes. You make a fool of me." But one Demosthenes assures him that he has just the qualifications for ruling the people. Is he not a rascal and free from all education? The tanner, fearing that he is to be deposed, protests his services and his loyalty to Demos. No one except the harlots, he urges, has done so much for Demos as he. There is the usual Aristophanic burlesque. The sausage seller belabors the tanner with tripe and primes himself for an oratorical contest in the assembly by eating garlic. A contest in adulation ensues to see which of the candidates can praise Demos the more lavishly and deserve better of Demos and his belly. The rivals bring a feast of good things and lay them before Demos like a platter of pre-election promises. The sausage seller proposes that as a test of their honesty, each candidate's locker shall be searched. In the tanner's locker a heap of succulent dainties is found, in particular a massive cake, from which he has cut only a tiny slice for Demos, a reference to a current charge that Cleon had embezzled state funds. The tanner is dismissed, and the sausage seller becomes the ruler of Demos's house. The Wasps of 422 continues the satire on democracy in a milder and weaker vein. The chorus is composed of idle citizens, dressed as wasps, who seek to make an obol or two every day by serving as jurymen, in order that they may, by listening to sycophants and levying confiscatory fines, vote the money of the rich into the coffers of the state and the pockets of the poor. But Aristophanes' ruling interest in these early plays is to ridicule war and promote peace. The hero of the Acarnians of 425 is Eupolous, honest citizen, a farmer who complains that his land has been devastated by armies, so that he can no longer live by squeezing wine from his vineyards. He sees no reason for war, and is clear that he himself has no quarrel with the Spartans. Tired of waiting for the generals or the politicians to make peace, he signs a personal treaty with the Lacedaemonians, and when a chorus of war-patriotic neighbors denounces him, he replies, "Well, the very Spartans even, I've my doubts and scruples whether they've been totally to blame in every instance altogether." Chorus: "Not to blame in every instance? Villain, vagabond, how dare ye, talking treason to our faces, to suppose that we will spare ye?" He agrees to let them kill him if he cannot prove that Athens is as much to blame for the war as Sparta. His head is laid upon a chopping block, and he begins his argument. Presently an Athenian general enters, defeated, blustering, and profane. The chorus is disgusted with him and releases Eupolous, who pleases all by selling a wine called peace. It was a play of considerable audacity, possible only among a people trained to hear the other side. Taking advantage of the parabasis or digression in which the custom of comedy allowed the author to address the audience through the chorus or one of the characters, Aristophanes explained his function as a comic gadfly among the Athenians. Never since our poet presented comedies has he praised himself upon the stage, but he maintains that he has done you much that is good. If you no longer allow yourselves to be too much hoodwinked by strangers or seduced by flattery, if in politics you are no longer the ninnies you once were, it is thanks to him. Formerly, when delegates from other cities wanted to deceive you, they had but to style you the people crowned with violets. At the word violets you at once sat erect on the tips of your bums. Or, if to tickle your vanity someone spoke of rich and sleek Athens, he would get all, because he spoke of you as he would have of anchovies in oil. In cautioning you against such wiles, the poet has done you great service. In the piece of 421, the poet was triumphant. Cleon was dead, and Nicias was about to sign for Athens a treaty pledging peace and friendship with Sparta for 50 years. But a few years later hostilities were resumed, and in 411 Aristophanes, abandoning hope in his fellow citizens, invited the women of Greece to end the bloodshed. As the Lysistrata opens, the ladies of Athens, while their men are still asleep, gather at dawn in council near the Acropolis. They agree to withhold the comforts of love from their spouses until these come to terms with the enemy, and they send an embassy to the women of Sparta to invite their cooperation in this novel campaign for peace. The men, awake at last, call to the women to come home. When these refuse, the The men besiege them, but the attackers are repulsed with pails of hot water and torrents of speech. Lysistrata, dissolver of armies, reads the men a lesson. During the wars of old we bore with you, but we observed you carefully, and oftentimes when we were at home we used to hear that you had decided some matter badly. When we inquired about it, the men would answer, "What's that to you? Be silent." And we asked, "How is it, husband, that you men manage these affairs so foolishly?" The leader of the men answers that women must keep out of public matters because they cannot manage the treasury. As they debate, some of the women steal away to their husbands, muttering Aristophanic excuses. Lysistrata replies, "Why not? The wives have long had the management of their husbands' purses to the great advantage of both." She argues so well that the men are finally persuaded to call a conference of the warring states. When the delegates are gathered, Lysistrata arranges that they shall have all the wine they can drink. Soon they are in a happy mood, and the long-delayed treaty is signed. The chorus ends the play with a paean to peace. 2. Aristophanes and the Radicals. Behind the disintegration of Athenian public life, in the view of Aristophanes, lay two basic evils, democracy and irreligion. He agreed with Socrates that the sovereignty of the people had become a sovereignty of politicians, but he was convinced that the skepticism of Socrates, Anaxagoras, and the Sophists had helped to loosen those moral bonds which had once made for social order and personal integrity. In the clouds he made uproarious fun of the new philosophy. An old-fashioned gentleman by the name of Strepsiades, who is looking for an argument that may justify him in repudiating his debts, is delighted to hear that Socrates operates a thinking shop, where one may learn to prove anything, even if it is false. He finds his way to the school of very hard thinkers. In the middle of the classroom he sees Socrates suspended from the ceiling in a basket, engrossed in thought, while some of the students are bent down with noses to the ground. Strepsiades: "What are those people doing, stooping so oddly?" Student: "They are probing the secrets that lie deep as Tartarus." Strepsiades: "But why, excuse me, but their hindquarters, why are they stuck up so strangely in the air?" Student: "Their other ends are studying astronomy." Strepsiades asks Socrates for lessons. Socrates: "By what gods do you swear? For the gods are not a current coin with us." He points to the chorus of clouds. "These are the real gods." Strepsiades: "But come, is there no Zeus?" Socrates: "There is no Zeus." Strepsiades: "But who makes it rain, then?" Socrates: "These clouds. For have you ever seen rain without clouds? But if it were Zeus, he ought to rain in fine weather as well as when clouds appear." Strepsiades: "But tell me, who is it that thunders? This makes me tremble." Socrates: "These clouds, as they roll, thunder." Strepsiades: "How?" Socrates: "When they are full of water and are driven along, they fall heavily upon each other and burst with a clap." Strepsiades: "But who drives them? Is it not Zeus?" Socrates: "Not at all. The ethereal vortex drives them on." Strepsiades: "So the greatest of gods is vortex. But what makes the clap of thunder?" Socrates: "I will teach you from your own case. Were you ever, after being stuffed with broth at a festival, later disturbed in your stomach, and did a tumult suddenly rumble through you?" In another scene, Phidippides, son of Strepsiades, meets in personification just argument and unjust argument. The first tells him that he must imitate the stoic virtues of the men of Marathon, but the other preaches to him the new morality. What good, asks unjust argument, have men ever gained by justice or virtue or moderation? For one honest, successful, and respected man, there can always be found 10 dishonest, successful, and respected men. Consider the gods themselves. They lied, stole, murdered, and committed adultery, and they are worshipped by all the Greeks. When just argument doubts that most successful men have been dishonest, unjust argument asks him, "Come now, from what class do our lawyers spring?" Just argument: "Well, from the blackguards." Unjust argument: "Surely. Tell me again, what are our tragic poets?" Just argument: "Blackguards." Unjust argument: "And our public orators?" Just argument: "Blackguards all." Unjust argument: "Now look about you," turning and pointing to the audience. "Which class among our friends here seems the most numerous?" Just argument gravely examines the audience. The blackguards have it by a large majority. Pheidippides is so apt a pupil of unjust argument that he beats his father on the ground that he is strong enough to do it and enjoys it. And besides, he asks, "Did you not beat me when I was a boy?" Strepsiades begs for mercy in the name of Zeus, but Pheidippides informs him that Zeus no longer exists, having been replaced by Vortex. The enraged father runs out into the streets and calls upon all good citizens to destroy this new philosophy. They attack and burn down the thinking shop, and Socrates barely escapes with his life. We do not know what part this comedy played in the tragedy of Socrates. It was brought out in 423, 24 years before the famous trial. Its good-humored satire does not seem to have offended the philosopher. We are told that he stood throughout the performance to give his enemies a better shot. Plato pictures Socrates and Aristophanes as friends after the performance. Plato himself recommended the play to Dionysius I of Syracuse as a jolly extravaganza, and maintained his own friendship with Aristophanes even after his master's death. Of the three accusers of Socrates in 399, one, Meletus, was a child when the comedy was presented, and another, Anytus, was on friendly terms with Socrates after the play. Probably the later circulation of the play as literature did the sage more harm than its original performance. Socrates himself, in Plato's report of his defenses, referred to the play as one of the major sources of that bad reputation which was prejudicing his case with the jurors. There was another target in Athens, at which Aristophanes aimed his satire, and in this case the mood was one of implacable hostility. He distrusted the skepticism of the sophists, the moral, economic, and political individualism that was undermining the state, the sentimental feminism that was agitating the women, and the socialism that was arousing the slaves. All these evils he saw at their clearest in Euripides, and he resolved to destroy with laughter the influence of the great dramatist upon the mind of Greece. He began in 411 with a play which he called the Thesmophoriazousi, from the women who celebrated in sexual exclusiveness the feast of Demeter and Persephone. The assembled devotees discuss the latest quips of Euripides against their sex and plan revenge. Euripides gets wind of the proceedings and persuades his father-in-law, Mnesilicus, to dress as a woman and enter the meeting to defend him. The first complainant alleges that the tragic dramatist has deprived her of a living. Formerly she made wreaths for the temples, but since Euripides has shown that there are no gods, the temple business has been ruined. Mnesilicus defends Euripides on the ground that his worst sayings about women are visibly and audibly true, and are mild compared with what women themselves know to be their faults. The ladies suspect that this traducer of the sex cannot be a woman. They tear off Mnesilicus's disguise, and he saves himself from dismemberment only by snatching a babe from a woman's arms and threatening to kill it if they touch him. As they nevertheless attack him, he unwraps the child and finds that it is a wineskin disguised to escape the collector of internal revenue. He proposes to cut its throat just the same, much to the distress of its owner. "Spare my darling," she cries, "or at least bring a bowl, and if it must die, let us catch its blood." Mnesilicus solves the problem by drinking the wine, and meanwhile sending an appeal to Euripides for rescue. Euripides appears in various parts from his plays, now as Menelaus, now as Perseus, now as Echo, and finally arranges Mnesilicus's escape. The Frogs of 405 returns to the assault despite Euripides' death. Dionysus, god of the drama, is dissatisfied with the surviving playwrights of Athens and descends to Hades to bring back Euripides. As he is ferried over to the lower world, a choir of frogs greets him with a croaking chorus that must have provided a month's catchword for young Athenians. Aristophanes pokes much fun at Dionysus in passing and boldly parodies the mysteries of Eleusis. When the god arrives in Hades, he finds Euripides attempting to unseat Aeschylus as king of all dramatists. Aeschylus accuses Euripides of spreading skepticism and a dangerous casuistry, and of corrupting the morals of Athenian women and youth. Ladies of refinement, he says, have been known to kill themselves through shame at having heard Euripides' obscenities. A pair of scales is brought in, and each poet throws into it lines from his plays. One mighty phrase of Aeschylus, here the satire strikes the older poet too, tips the scale against a dozen of Euripides. At last Aeschylus proposes that the younger dramatist shall leap into one scale with wife, children, and baggage, while he will guarantee to find a couplet that will outweigh them all. In the end, the great skeptic loses the contest, and Aeschylus is brought back to Athens as victor. This oldest known essay in literary criticism received the first prize from the judges and so pleased the audience that another performance of it was given a few days afterward. In a middling play called the Ecclesiazusi of 393, that is, the Assemblywomen, Aristophanes turned his laughter upon the radical movement in general. The ladies of Athens disguise themselves as men, pack the assembly, outvote their husbands, brothers, and sons, and elect themselves rulers of the state. Their leader is a fiery suffragette, Praxagora, who berates her sex as fools for letting themselves be ruled by such adults as men, and proposes that all wealth shall be divided equally among the citizens, leaving the slaves uncontaminated with gold. The attack upon Utopia takes a more graceful form in Aristophanes' masterpiece, The Birds of 414. Two citizens who despair of Athens climb up to the abode of the birds, hoping to find there an ideal life. With the help of the birds, they build, between earth and heaven, a utopian city, Nephelococcygia, or Cloud Cuckoo Land. The birds, in a chorus as lyrically perfect as anything in the tragic poets, apostrophize mankind. Ye children of man, whose life is a span, protracted with sorrow from day to day, naked and featherless, feeble and querulous, sickly calamitous creatures of clay, attend to the words of the sovereign birds, immortal, illustrious lords of the air, who survey from on high with a merciful eye your struggles of misery, labor, and care. The birds plan to intercept all communication between the gods and men. No sacrifices shall be allowed to mount to heaven. Soon, say the reformers, the old gods will starve and the birds will be supreme. New gods are invented in the image of birds, and those conceived in the image of men are deposed. Finally, an embassy comes from Olympus, seeking a truce. The leader of the birds agrees to take as his wife the handmaiden of Zeus, and the play ends in a happy marriage. 3. The Artist and the Thinker. Aristophanes is an unclassifiable mixture of beauty, wisdom, and filth. When the mood is upon him, he can write lyrics of purest Greek serene, which no translator has ever yet conveyed. His dialogue is life itself, or perhaps it is swifter, racier, more vigorous than life dares be. He belongs with Rabelais, Shakespeare, and Dickens in the lusty vitality of his style, and like theirs his characters give us more keenly the shape and aroma of the time than all the works of the historians. No one who has not read Aristophanes can know the Athenians. His plots are ridiculous and are put together with an almost extempore carelessness. Sometimes the main theme is exhausted before the play is half through, and the remainder limps forward on the crutches of burlesque. The humor is generally of a low order. It cracks and groans with facile puns, drags itself out to tragic lengths, and too often depends upon digestion, reproduction, and excretion. In the Acharnians we hear of a character who eases himself continuously for 8 months. In the Clouds, the major forms of human waste are mingled with sublime philosophy. Every second page offers us rumps, wind, bosoms, gonads, coitus, pederasty, onanism. Everything is here. He charges his old rival, Cratinus, with nocturnal incontinence. He is the most contemporary of ancient poets, for nothing is so timeless as obscenity. Coming to him after any other Greek author, worst of all after Euripides, he seems depressingly vulgar, and we find it difficult to imagine the same audience enjoying them both. If we are good conservatives, we can stomach all this on the ground that Aristophanes attacks every form of radicalism and upholds devotedly every ancient virtue and vice. He is the most immoral of all Greek writers known to us, but he hopes to make up for it by attacking immorality. He is always found on the side of the rich, but he denounces cowardice. He lies pitilessly about Euripides, living and dead, but assails dishonesty. He describes the women of Athens as unbelievably coarse, but he exposes Euripides for defaming them. He burlesques the gods so boldly that in comparison with the pious Socrates, we must picture him as an hilarious atheist. But he is all for religion and accuses the philosophers of undermining the gods. Yet it took real courage to caricature the powerful Cleon and to paint the faults of Demos to Demos's face. It took insight to see in the trend of religion and morals, from sophistic skepticism to Epicurean individualism, a basic danger to the life of Athens. Perhaps Athens would have fared better if it had taken some of his advice, moderated her imperialism, made an early peace with Sparta, and mitigated with aristocratic leadership the chaos and corruption of post-Periclean democracy. Aristophanes failed because he did not take his own counsels seriously enough to observe them himself. His excesses of pornography and abuse were partly responsible for the law forbidding personal satire, and though the law was soon repealed, the old comedy of political criticism died before the death of Aristophanes in 385, and was replaced even in his later plays by the middle comedy of manners and romance. But the vitality of the Greek comic theater disappeared along with its extravagance and brutality. Philemon and Menander rose and passed and were forgotten, while Aristophanes survived all changes of moral and literary fashions to come down to our own time with 11 of his 42 plays intact. Even today, despite all difficulties of understanding and translation, Aristophanes is alive, and, if we hold our noses, we can read him with profane delight.